The date is August 29, 1988. The stage is set at Madison Square Garden for the inaugural SummerSlam, a colossal event designed to solidify the World Wrestling Federation's burgeoning pay-per-view empire. The air crackles with anticipation, a symphony of cheers and jeers swelling as two behemoths stride purposefully toward the ring. Their names are the Barbarian and the Warlord, collectively known as the Powers of Pain, and they are a spectacle of raw, unadulterated power. The Warlord, a sculpted titan, moves with an almost balletic grace for a man of his immense size, while the Barbarian, a snarling, muscle-bound savage, exudes an aura of untamed fury. Their opponents, the Bolsheviks, Nikolai Volkov and Boris Zhukov, appear almost insignificant in comparison, a mere formality for what promises to be a dominant display. And dominant it was. The bell rings, and the Powers of Pain unleash a relentless assault. The Barbarian, with his signature headbutt, sends Zhukov reeling. The Warlord, with his surprising agility, then effortlessly scoops him up for a devastating power slam. The match is short, brutal, and utterly decisive. The Powers of Pain dismantle the Bolsheviks with a chilling efficiency that leaves the Madison Square Garden crowd buzzing. They were everything Vince McMahon seemed to covet. Massive, intimidating, and possessing an undeniable in-ring prowess. This was not just a victory, it felt like a coronation, an emphatic declaration that the World Wrestling Federation had found its next great monster tag team, a duo destined to dominate the division for years to come. Many, including a significant segment of the wrestling faithful, believed they were more well-built, more athletic, and arguably even more talented in the ring than their contemporaries, Demolition, or even the soon-to-arrive Legion of Doom. They looked like champions, walked like champions, and wrestled like champions. So why did it never happen? Why did these seemingly unstoppable forces, these legitimate monsters, never once capture the Federation Tag Team Championship belts? Why, despite their formidable appearance and undeniable in-ring capabilities, were the Powers of Pain ultimately buried, relegated to the mid-card, and eventually split apart, their championship potential unfulfilled? To understand the curious case of the Powers of Pain, we must first briefly trace their origins. Before their Federation arrival, the Barbarian and the Warlord had already made their mark in the National Wrestling Alliance territories. Managed by Paul Jones, they formed the Powers of Pain in late 1987. Their NWA tenure was brief but impactful, most notably marked by a brutal feud with the legendary Road Warriors. This rivalry, which even involved a kayfabe injury to Road Warrior Animal, showcased their immense power and established a clear stylistic parallel with the Warriors. They even captured the six-man tag team championship alongside Ivan Koloff, a testament to their immediate impact. Their departure, reportedly due to their refusal to participate in scaffold matches, foreshadowed a more pragmatic approach. When the Powers of Pain debuted in the World Wrestling Federation in the summer of 1988, they were positioned as immediate threats. Their televised debut on an episode of Superstars saw them effortlessly dispatching enhancement talent, showcasing their overwhelming power. Initially, and rather surprisingly, they were introduced as baby faces, managed by Tito Santana. Their primary target was Demolition, who had recently defeated Santana and Rick Martel's Strike Force for the Tag Team Championship. The narrative was clear. The Powers of Pain were mercenaries brought in to seek revenge. This initial face run, though brief, demonstrated an interesting dynamic. The crowd, drawn to their sheer physicality, responded positively. Comparing them to other teams of the era, they were undeniably more jacked than Demolition, more athletic than the Hart Foundation, and possessed a greater aura of legitimate toughness than many of their contemporaries. Their definitive arrival as a force to be reckoned with came at the aforementioned SummerSlam 1988, where they absolutely decimated the Bolsheviks, a performance that solidified their monster status. The most pivotal moment in the Powers of Pain's Federation career, and arguably the point where their championship hopes began to unravel, occurred at the 1988 Survivor Series. In a dramatic double turn, Demolition's manager, Mr. Fuji, notoriously betrayed his team, costing them the match. The Powers of Pain, in a shocking move, aligned themselves with Fuji, turning heel in the process, while Demolition, now sympathetic figures, became fan favorites. This switch, while setting up a compelling rivalry, also inadvertently sealed the Powers of Pain's fate. They went on to win the Survivor Series match, only for Demolition to storm back into the ring, setting the stage for their bitter feud. Following this dramatic turn, the Powers of Pain, now managed by the devious Mr. Fuji, engaged in a series of highly anticipated championship matches against Demolition at house shows. These bouts, often ending in double disqualifications or narrow count-out victories for the Powers of Pain, were designed to keep Demolition strong while building anticipation for a definitive pay-per-view clash. However, the definitive championship victory never materialized. At WrestleMania VI, arguably the grandest stage of them all, the Powers of Pain and Mr. Fuji competed against Demolition in a handicap match for the titles. In a surprising twist, Demolition retained the championships by pinning Mr. Fuji, effectively neutering the Powers of Pain's championship aspirations in a single decisive moment. This was a clear signal. The push had been halted, the championship path diverted. So why the sudden shift? Why, after such a dominant debut and clear positioning as championship contenders, were the Powers of Pain denied the gold? One significant factor lies in the evolving landscape of the World Wrestling Federation itself. In the late 1980s, professional wrestling was rapidly transforming from a regional strongman competition into a global sports entertainment spectacle. While in-ring prowess remained important, charisma, mic skills, and the ability to connect with the audience on a deeper level became paramount. Demolition, despite their intimidating appearance, possessed a unique chemistry with the crowds. Axe and Smash, though not eloquent speakers, had catchphrases, a distinct look, and a certain playful menace that resonated with fans. The Powers of Pain, by contrast, while undeniably imposing in the ring, were comparatively one-dimensional outside of it. The Barbarian, true to his moniker, was a man of few words, and the Warlord, while articulate, lacked the bombastic theatricality that Vince McMahon increasingly desired. Their promos, while conveying a sense of menace, lacked the nuanced connection that Demolition forged with the audience. They looked the part, but in the burgeoning world of sports entertainment, they arguably couldn't quite play the part to the same degree as their contemporaries. Their presence was undeniable, their skills in the ring arguably stronger than both Demolition and Legion of Doom, but outside the ropes, for promos and theatrics, the connection wasn't as clear. Another crucial, perhaps even the most significant reason, was the looming shadow of the Road Warriors. Vince McMahon had long coveted Animal and Hawk, the original and quintessential monster tag team. The Powers of Pain, with their similar look, intensity, and even their pre-Federation feud with the Warriors, were perceived by many, including McMahon himself, as a powerful, albeit temporary stand-in for the real deal. McMahon's relentless pursuit of the Legion of Doom meant that any team perceived as too similar, no matter how talented, would likely be seen as a placeholder rather than a long-term investment for the top spot. Once the Road Warriors finally made their way to the Federation as the Legion of Doom, the need for the Powers of Pain in that specific monster role diminished considerably. This wasn't merely a political preference, it was a strategic decision to secure the industry's most iconic monster tag team. It's also no secret that Vince McMahon often favored talent he had discovered or cultivated within his own system. Demolition, while undeniably drawing inspiration from the Road Warriors, were, in essence, of his own creation. Axe and Smash were loyal and reliable performers who had a good working relationship with management. The Powers of Pain, on the other hand, arrived from a rival promotion. While their talent was undeniable, there may have been an underlying preference for teams that were company-grown. McMahon was known to be meticulous about controlling his product, and a team that had established itself elsewhere, particularly a commanding team like the Powers of Pain, might have been viewed with a slightly different lens. There's a subtle but crucial difference between belonging to the Federation and merely arriving as a force. It often decides who rises and who gets buried. The booking decisions surrounding the Powers of Pain vividly illustrate this lack of sustained commitment. Matches that should have been definitive statements, particularly against Demolition, often ended inconclusively, preventing the Powers of Pain from gaining the necessary momentum for a championship reign. Their positioning at WrestleMania VI, where their manager took the fall, was a clear signal that their championship aspirations were being consciously curtailed. Each non-decision, each opportunity missed, was, in essence, a decision by management not to push them to the ultimate prize. Following their failure to capture the Tag Team Championship, The Powers of Pain slowly but surely began their decline down the card. They continued to feud with prominent teams like the Hart Foundation, the Bushwhackers, and the Rockers, but the aura of invincibility that had surrounded them upon their debut began to dissipate. At the 1989 Survivor Series, the Powers of Pain, along with the $1 Million Man and Zeus, were part of the $1 Million Team, suffering a loss to the Hulkamaniacs, which included Hulk Hogan and Demolition. In March 1990, the inevitable happened with the splitting of the team. Mr. Fuji, in a storyline move, sold the Barbarians' contract to Bobby the Brain Heenan and the Warlords' contract to Slick. Their final match as the Powers of Pain in the Federation saw them defeated by Hulk Hogan and the Big Boss Man, marking a symbolic end to their run as a dominant unit. Individually, both Barbarian and Warlord continued their careers in the Federation, with Barbarian even receiving a brief singles push under Heenan and Warlord struggling somewhat in his solo efforts. They would reunite briefly in Japan in 1991, and later in World Championship Wrestling in 1995 as the Masked Super Assassins. But these were fleeting moments that never recaptured their initial Federation promise. The Warlord ultimately retired due to injuries in early 1996, while Barbarian continued his career, most notably forming the Faces of Fear with Meng in World Championship Wrestling. The Powers of Pain's story in the Federation is a compelling illustration of how, in the world of professional wrestling, looking unstoppable isn't always enough. Their physical prowess, intimidating presence, and undeniable in-ring ability were all present. Yet they lacked the intangible elements that truly captivated Vince McMahon. The larger-than-life personalities, the mic skills to cut compelling promos, and perhaps most crucially, the unique timing that would have allowed them to ascend without being overshadowed by a team McMahon coveted even more. They were legitimate monsters, capable of awe-inspiring feats of strength and brutality. But in the evolving landscape of the Federation, where entertainment and character became as vital as athleticism, the Powers of Pain, for all their strength, ultimately found themselves caught in a booking conundrum, forever relegated to the what-if column of wrestling history. Their narrative serves as a powerful reminder that even the most formidable individuals can be swallowed by the currents of professional wrestling's unique blend of athleticism, politics, and showmanship. The date is March 24, 1991. The Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena hums with a crackling electricity, a cathedral of controlled chaos. On this night, WrestleMania VII, the very zenith of sports entertainment, is underway. Amidst the pageantry and the thunderous roar of the crowd, two men, sculpted and radiating an undeniable aura of power, step into the squared circle. They are Paul Roma, a man sculpted with improbable precision and whose countenance bespoke a simmering arrogance, and Hercules, a living embodiment of his namesake, a formidable behemoth with a grim intensity. Together, they are power and glory, and they stand on the precipice of what appears to be an ascendancy. Their opponents are the Legion of Doom, Animal and Hawk, a tandem of unparalleled ferocity whose spiked shoulder pads and painted faces struck fear into the hearts of mere mortals. The bell rings and the air thickens with anticipation, the clash of titans imminent. But what unfolds is not a protracted struggle, not a test of endurance, but a sudden, brutal, and almost clinical dismantling. In a mere 59 seconds, the Legion of Doom executes their signature, devastating maneuver, the Doomsday Device, on Paul Roma. Animal covers him, and the referee's hand slaps the mat 3 times. Just like that, the bright burning flame of power and glory, seemingly poised to illuminate the Federation's tag team division, flickered and, in essence, disappeared. They were on the grandest stage with so much promise, only to be utterly, unequivocally buried. Why did Vince McMahon, the architect of this vast theatrical empire, orchestrate such a swift and decisive end for a team that possessed the look, the athleticism, and the undeniable potential for greatness? This is the perplexing narrative we shall unravel, a tale of ambition, of perception, and of the enigmatic whims of a singular visionary. To understand their demise, we must first understand their genesis and their inherent appeal. Power and Glory emerged in mid-1990, a calculated fusion of two talents that, individually, had struggled to break through the upper echelons of the Federation. Paul Roma, initially a part of the Young Stallions, possessed an undeniable athletic prowess and a physique that was ahead of its time. He was a solid mid-card performer, but often found himself in the thankless role of enhancement talent. Hercules, on the other hand, was a veteran, a powerhouse who had engaged in notable feuds but never quite captured championship gold. He had a formidable, intense presence, a living statue of muscle. Their pairing, facilitated by the cunning Slick, was a stroke of genius. Slick, with his sharp suits and charismatic edge, provided the perfect foil for their silent, brooding intensity. He became their mouthpiece, their strategic advisor, and an essential component of their overall presentation. The name Power and Glory was evocative, a simple yet potent descriptor of their combined attributes. Roma embodied the glory, the aesthetic appeal, the agile grace. Hercules was the power, the raw, unadulterated strength. Their matching outfits, sleek and formidable, further cemented their unified identity. Their in-ring chemistry was remarkably fluid for a team that had only recently been cobbled together. They moved with a synchronized brutality, executing double-team maneuvers with precision. Their finisher, a devastating combination of Hercules' superplex and Roma's top rope splash, was impactful and visually stunning, often eliciting audible reactions from the crowd. It was a move that showcased both their strength and their agility, a microcosm of their combined appeal. They were heels, but not cartoonish villains. Their villainy stemmed from a cocky arrogance, a belief in their own undeniable superiority, which felt grounded in a certain realism. They were a compelling contrast to the more outlandish characters that populated the Federation at the time. Power and Glory seemed destined for success for several compelling reasons. Both Roma and Hercules were physically imposing, yet surprisingly athletic for their size, offering a dynamic that wasn't always present in the Federation's tag team division. Their visual appeal was undeniable. They looked like $1 million, projecting an image of power and athletic grace. They fit perfectly into the evolving tag team landscape of the era. Demolition, a dominant force for years, was fading, their monstrous mystique waning. The Hart Foundation, another iconic duo, was on the cusp of dissolution. The time was ripe for a new, formidable heel team to emerge, and Power and Glory fit the bill. Their momentum was palpable. They secured significant victories on flagship programs like Superstars, cutting solid, arrogant promos that further established their heel personas. They weren't generating white-hot reactions, but their reception was respectable, indicating a growing interest among the audience. They felt like the natural successors, the next logical contenders for the coveted Tag Team Championship. Their feud with the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, was instrumental in establishing the duo. It began with a brutal, unprovoked attack on the Rockers, turning Roma and Hercules definitively heel. This storyline allowed them to showcase their vicious streak and their ability to work a compelling narrative. At SummerSlam 1990, Power and Glory decimated Marty Jannetty in a handicap match after injuring Shawn Michaels' knee. This victory, even if it was against a single opponent, further solidified their image as a dominant force. The feud continued, culminating in a series of highly physical matches, including a significant encounter at Survivor Series, where Power and Glory once again emerged victorious. These wins against one of the most popular babyface teams of the era were a clear indication that the company was investing in them, that they were being groomed for something significant. They even challenged the then tag team champions, the Hart Foundation, multiple times, though they were never able to secure the titles. While the gold eluded them, the fact that they were consistently in contention for the championships underscored their perceived potential. Yet despite this upward trajectory, WrestleMania VII marked the precipitous beginning of their end. The decision to have them eviscerated in under a minute by the Legion of Doom was not merely a loss. It was a public execution of their credibility. A squash match, especially on a stage as grand and visible as WrestleMania, is a death sentence for any team or individual on the wrong side of it. It communicates in no uncertain terms that the company has no further plans for them. There was no follow-up feud, no attempt to explain the loss, no narrative arc to redeem them. From that moment on, in the eyes of the fans, Power and Glory were no longer contenders. They were an afterthought. Backstage murmurs and later revelations from those close to the company confirmed the stark reality. Vince McMahon had no further plans for them beyond that single devastating encounter. The question then arises, why? Why did the visionary, who had seemingly invested so much in their development, who had given them a powerful manager, a defining finisher, and significant wins over popular teams, abruptly pull the plug? The answer, like so many narratives within the opaque world of professional wrestling, is multifaceted. A confluence of booking philosophy, marketing considerations, and the often unpredictable whims of the man at the top. One primary factor was McMahon's evolving vision for his company during that specific era. The late 1980s and early 1990s were the height of the cartoonish wrestling character. McMahon wanted larger-than-life personalities, characters that were easily digestible for a young, impressionable audience, characters that could be packaged and merchandised. The Legion of Doom, with their spiked shoulder pads and painted faces, were perfect examples of this. The Bushwhackers, the Nasty Boys. These were characters that were almost caricatures. Power and Glory, despite their impressive physiques and undeniable skill, were perhaps too grounded, too realistic for McMahon's increasingly fantastical universe. They projected strength and arrogance, but they weren't exaggerated enough. Slick provided some flair, but the team itself lacked that over-the-top, almost cartoonish element that Vince craved for his marketable stars. They looked like professional athletes, not comic book superheroes, and in that era, the latter was often preferred. This leads directly to the second crucial factor: merchandising. The Federation machine was, and remains, a merchandising behemoth. Toys, t-shirts, action figures, these were significant revenue streams. The most successful characters were those that translated easily into marketable products. The Legion of Doom had their spikes and paint. The Hart Foundation had their signature pink and black gear and sunglasses. The Nasty Boys had their wild street-brawling aesthetic. What was the unique hook for Power and Glory that kids could latch onto? They looked great, they were powerful, but they lacked that distinct, toy-friendly visual identity. Their strength and glory, while impressive in the ring, didn't translate into a compelling toy line. In McMahon's business model, if you couldn't be easily commoditized, your shelf life might be inherently limited. Locker room politics and perception also played an undeniable role. While Paul Roma was a talented athlete, he was largely perceived within the company as a mid-carder at best. He had a good look, but perhaps not the it factor that McMahon sought in his main event players. Hercules, though respected for his longevity and power, was aging and not viewed as a long-term investment or a future main eventer. The team, therefore, was likely seen as a placeholder, a temporary solution to fill a gap in the tag team division, rather than a long-term project McMahon was willing to invest heavily in. He never seemed to fully believe in their ultimate potential to be a top-tier act. They served their purpose, which was to build up other teams, and once that purpose was served, they became expendable. Finally, the harsh truth was that they might have been too similar to other teams, or simply lost in the shuffle. The Federation roster was deep, and the tag team division, while in transition, still featured a variety of acts. Power and Glory, while good, might not have stood out enough in a sea of distinct personalities. They weren't bad by any stretch, they were simply not prioritized. In the cutthroat world of the Federation, simply being good was rarely enough. You had to be extraordinary, or at the very least exceptionally unique. After the ignominious defeat at WrestleMania VII, the writing was on the wall. Power and Glory rapidly lost television time, their appearances becoming increasingly sporadic. They were relegated to putting over other teams, their role shifting from contenders to enhancement talent themselves. Their final pay-per-view appearance, a symbolic curtain call, came at SummerSlam 1991, where they joined the Warlord in a forgettable loss to Steamboat, Von Erich, and Davey Boy Smith, signaling the quiet end of Power and Glory. Shortly thereafter, without any fanfare, without a definitive breakup angle, the team quietly disbanded. Hercules remained with the company for a few more months before departing, while Paul Roma re-emerged in World Championship Wrestling, notably as a member of the Four Horsemen, an ironic twist given his perceived status in the Federation. There was no farewell, no dramatic ending, no resolution to their story. They were simply gone, a footnote in the annals of Federation history. The date is March 29, 1987. The Pontiac Silverdome in Pontiac, Michigan, pulsates with an energy that could power a small city. Over 93,000 souls, a record-shattering assembly, are crammed into every conceivable space, their collective roar a visceral force that vibrates through the very concrete of the stadium. This is WrestleMania III, the undeniable zenith of the World Wrestling Federation's golden era, a spectacle of grandeur and bombast that would forever etch itself into the annals of sports entertainment. The air is thick with anticipation, the aroma of popcorn and sweat, and the electric hum of a truly historic event unfolding. Amidst this colossal tapestry of larger-than-life characters and wrestling gods, two figures emerge, their entrance a stark contrast to the flamboyant theatricality of many of their peers, yet instantly recognizable and cheered by a vocal throng. Clad in bright yellow trunks adorned with bold black stripes, Jumpin' Jim Brunzell and B. Brian Blair, collectively known as the Killer Bees, make their way down the impossibly long aisle. They aren't the main event, not the hulking titans or the cartoonish villains, but they are undoubtedly popular. They were pitted against the nefarious duo of the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov. The match itself, while brief, was the height of Federation theater. Nikolai's obligatory, universally reviled rendition of the Soviet national anthem was cut short by the patriotic intrusion of Hacksaw Jim Duggan, brandishing his trusty 2x4 and bellowing about the land of the free and the home of the brave. The ensuing chaos, a melee of patriotism and villainy, culminated in Duggan striking the Iron Sheik, leading to a disqualification. Despite the loss, the Killer Bees were there, on the biggest stage, in front of the largest audience in wrestling history to date, integral to a memorable segment. They were a fixture, a reliably exciting tag team that consistently delivered, always generating a strong reaction. They were, by all accounts, a success story in the Federation's burgeoning empire. Yet, less than 2 years later, this popular, highly recognized tag team, a consistent presence in the Federation's increasingly crowded landscape, would be gone. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic breakup, not even with a formal announcement. They would simply fade away, discarded. Like a used prop, a set piece no longer deemed necessary. Vince McMahon, the architect of this grand wrestling opera, the man who had elevated professional wrestling from a regional attraction to a global phenomenon, would essentially, and quite deliberately, kill the Killer Bees. But why? What could compel the visionary, who seemingly reveled in crafting heroes and villains, to dismantle a successful fan-favorite act with such clinical precision? The reasons are as complex as the man himself, a confluence of strategic shifts, personal preferences, and the unyielding, often brutal realities of a rapidly evolving industry. To understand their demise, we must first understand their ascent, and the subtle, yet ultimately fatal cracks that began to appear beneath their vibrant yellow and black facade. Jim Brunzell, with his crisp, scientific mat work and explosive athleticism, was already a seasoned veteran before donning the yellow and black. He had achieved considerable fame as one half of the High Flyers in the American Wrestling Association, capturing the World Tag Team Championship on 2 occasions. He was a known quantity, a proven commodity, celebrated for his legitimate wrestling prowess and his ability to engage a crowd with his high-flying offense. B. Brian Blair, on the other hand, was a product of Hiro Matsuda's rigorous training and had honed his craft across various territories, including prior stints in the Federation, before truly finding his footing. While often utilized as enhancement talent in his earlier Federation runs, Blair possessed a solid fundamental skill set and a tenacious spirit. When the Federation embarked on its ambitious national expansion in 1985, gobbling up talent from regional promotions across the country, both men found themselves within McMahon's orbit. It was reportedly Hulk Hogan, the undisputed face of the company, who suggested pairing Blair and Brunzell, recognizing their complementary styles and similar builds. The Killer Bees moniker, a clever play on the Miami Dolphins' formidable Killer Bees defensive line, a unit whose members also shared the initial B in their surnames. It was catchy, memorable, and immediately conveyed a sense of quickness and teamwork. From their debut on June 17, 1985, where they defeated the team of Steve Lombardi and Dave Barbie, the Killer Bees quickly established themselves. They were not powerhouses, nor were they monstrous figures designed to intimidate. Their appeal lay in their athleticism, their undeniable chemistry, and one singular distinctive gimmick: The masked confusion was a stroke of genius, though almost anachronistic for a babyface team. It was a heel tactic, the quintessential move of villainous rule breakers. Yet when executed by the Bees, it was celebrated. The visual of both men, identical in masks and attire, creating pandemonium in the ring while the referee feigned utter bewilderment, was pure entertainment. It allowed them to win matches in a cheeky, unconventional manner, cementing their status as lovable rogues who played by their own rules. Their momentum through 1986 and 1987 was undeniable. They engaged in compelling, long-running feuds with some of the era's most iconic tag teams. The Hart Foundation, with their undeniable technical prowess and conniving tactics, provided a perfect foil for the Bees' more straightforward, spirited approach. The Funks, specifically Hoss and Jimmy Jack, offered a different challenge, a brawling, unhinged style that contrasted sharply with the Bees' agility. Their appearance at the big event in Toronto in August 1986, facing Hoss and Jimmy Jack Funk in front of a staggering 70,000 fans, demonstrated their significant drawing power, even on cards headlined by megastars like Hulk Hogan. While they received a few unsuccessful shots at the reigning tag team champions, the Dream Team, the titles eluded them. They were always in the mix, always a threat, and always over with the crowd. They didn't need the gold to be treated like champions by the fans. Their consistent performances and engaging gimmick were more than enough. They survived the grueling 10-team elimination match at the inaugural Survivor Series in 1987, a testament to their resilience and perceived viability within the division. Their final WrestleMania appearance at WrestleMania IV saw them once again in a battle royal, a sign, perhaps, of a subtle shift in their standing. So how did a tag team so consistently popular, so reliably over, find themselves so unceremoniously discarded? The answer lies in the shifting sands of Vince McMahon's vision, a vision that prioritized a very specific type of performer and a particular aesthetic. Firstly, the gimmick, for all its cleverness, had a ceiling. Masked confusion was entertaining, but it wasn't the stuff of main events. It was a novelty, a comedic interlude, rather than a foundation for a championship reign. McMahon, ever the showman, began to gravitate towards larger-than-life characters, those who could transcend the confines of traditional wrestling and become mainstream entertainment icons. While the Bees were athletic and visually distinct, they weren't physically intimidating in the way McMahon increasingly desired. He adored giants, powerhouses, and performers with painted faces and elaborate costumes that screamed cartoon hero or comic book villain. The Bees, with their relatively conventional builds and straightforward presentation, simply didn't fit this evolving mold. They were, in essence, too wrestler and not enough superstar for the direction McMahon was pushing. Secondly, the Federation's tag team division exploded in the mid to late 1980s. The landscape became saturated with compelling duos. The British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation, Demolition, the Islanders, the Rougeaus, the Powers of Pain, the Rockers, and more. Each team brought something unique to the table, and many of them possessed the larger, more theatrical personas that McMahon favored. In such a crowded field, a team, no matter how popular, could easily get lost in the shuffle if they weren't perceived as having that indefinable it factor that transcended their ring work. Crucially, the Killer Bees were never truly Vince's guys in the way some others were. They didn't have the kind of backstage pull or the controversial heat that could propel a team to the top. They were professional, reliable, and consistent. But they didn't generate the kind of buzz, positive or negative, that McMahon often cultivated around his favored acts. They were simply pros doing solid work, and in a company driven by spectacle and personality, solid sometimes wasn't enough. As the Federation's priorities shifted towards toy-friendly gimmicks and a more muscular aesthetic, the Bees, lacking a truly unique visual signature beyond their attire and the occasional mask, began to lose ground. Inevitably, they transitioned into becoming enhancement talent. Their role slowly, imperceptibly, shifted from being contenders to being a reliable team to put over newer, favored acts. Their last truly prominent appearance came at WrestleFest in the summer of 1988, where they lost to the fabulous Rougeaus. Shortly thereafter, the Killer Bees effectively split up off-screen, without any dramatic breakup, announcement, or fanfare. There was no grand farewell match, no emotional parting of ways. They simply stopped teaming. Brunzell remained with the Federation into the early 1990s, wrestling as a singles competitor and achieving victories on house shows, but rarely on television. Blair remained until early November 1988, primarily scoring wins over preliminary wrestlers, but failing to break through against more established names. The vibrant yellow and black days of the Bees were, at least temporarily, over. It was a quiet fade, a gradual disappearance from the forefront of the Federation's programming. No retirement angle, no grand send-off. Just gone. Vince McMahon had made his choice. The Killer Bees, for all their popularity and skill, were never going to be the tag team champions. They were a valuable component for a time, a beloved act. But ultimately, they were deemed expendable in the relentless pursuit of bigger, bolder, and more marketable stars. At WrestleMania III, they stood on the biggest stage in wrestling, embraced by a sea of fans who adored their unique charm and exhilarating in-ring style. They were a popular, reliable act, perfectly embodying the spirit of the Federation's golden age. But in the eyes of Vince McMahon, the ultimate arbiter of success and failure in his empire, they were never more than a novelty. And in the World Wrestling Federation, under the singular vision of its chairman, novelties, no matter how beloved, rarely survive the relentless march towards the next grand spectacle. The date is March 27, 1988. The Atlantic City air, still crisp with the tail end of winter, hums with an electric anticipation. Inside Trump Plaza, a cacophony of 19,000 voices rise and fall in waves, a living entity pulsating with the energy of professional wrestling's grandest spectacle. This is WrestleMania IV, the undisputed zenith of the Golden Era, a time when the World Wrestling Federation, under the audacious vision of Vince McMahon, has truly transcended the squared circle to become a pop culture juggernaut. Tito Santana and Rick Martel, collectively known as Strikeforce, are the reigning tag team champions. They embody the era's ideal babyface, clean-cut, athletic, and perpetually smiling. As they stride towards the ring, their championship belts gleaming under the arena lights, they are met with a thunderous ovation. Here are the heroes, ready to defend their gold against the fearsome black leather-cladded duo of Demolition, Axe and Smash. It is a clash of styles, a collision of ideologies. The pure technical prowess of Strikeforce against the brute violence and dark menace of their challengers. The match itself proves to be a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Strikeforce, with their fluid double-team maneuvers and high-octane offense, keeps Demolition on their heels. Martel's signature Boston Crab has Smash writhing in agony, a submission victory seemingly moments away. Yet in the blink of an eye, the tide turns. Mr. Fuji, the insidious manager of Demolition, seizes an opportune moment, distracting the referee as Axe delivers a brutal cane shot to Martel. The illegal blow is decisive. Smash capitalizes, securing the pinfall, and in a shocking turn of events, Strikeforce's championship reign comes to an abrupt, unceremonious end. The loss, while certainly a setback, didn't immediately feel like a catastrophic blow. After all, this was WrestleMania, where upsets were commonplace and the landscape of the Federation was constantly shifting. The future, in the immediate aftermath, still seemed promising for Strikeforce. They were still popular, still talented, still beloved by the fans. But beneath the surface, an almost Machiavellian narrative was beginning to unfold. This wasn't merely a title loss, it was in retrospect the beginning of the end. A subtle, almost imperceptible unraveling, orchestrated by Vince McMahon, the man whose whims dictated the very fabric of the Federation. They were doomed, seemingly marked for a slow, agonizing burial. But why? Why would the architect of the Golden Era so decisively dismantle one of its most promising and popular tag teams? The answer, as is often the case, is complex, multifaceted, and deeply rooted in the capricious nature of professional wrestling's ultimate puppet master. To truly understand the why, we must first retrace the unlikely origins of Strikeforce and their meteoric rise. Before they were united under a single banner, both Tito Santana and Rick Martel had already carved out respectable, if not spectacular, careers in the wrestling world. Santana, a former Intercontinental Champion, was a perennial fan favorite, known for his relentless energy. Martel, a smooth, technically proficient grappler, had enjoyed success as one half of the Can-Am connection with Tom Zenk. Their partnership, however, was short-lived, with Zenk's abrupt departure in the summer of 1987. The Islanders, Haku and Tama, had been relentlessly taunting Martel, exploiting Zenk's absence to get under his skin. On the August 15, 1987 episode of Superstars, after Martel had defeated Barry Horowitz, the Islanders launched a brutal post-match assault. It was then that Tito Santana, serving as a commentator at the Spanish broadcast booth, sprang into action, rushing to the ring to aid Martel. The impromptu alliance sparked a natural chemistry. Santana, ever the opportunist, declared that as a team, they would be striking the Islanders with force. Martel, with a flash of inspiration, immediately christened them Strike Force. The name was perfect, embodying their aggressive yet principled approach. Their look and energy were a perfect reflection of the late 1980s babyface archetype. They were handsome, athletic, and radiated an aura of clean-cut heroism. Their theme music, originally intended for the Can-Am connection, reinforced this image of carefree, charismatic good guys. They immediately clicked with the audience, who were eager to embrace a new dynamic duo. Their feud with the Islanders culminated, and they finally secured a shot at the coveted Tag Team Championship against the formidable Hart Foundation. On October 27, 1987, at a Superstars taping in Syracuse, New York, Strikeforce achieved the pinnacle of their tag team journey. Rick Martel forced Jim Neidhart to submit to his Boston Crab, and Strikeforce were declared the new tag team champions. Their reign, though relatively brief by Golden Era standards, was impactful. They successfully defended their titles against both the Hart Foundation and the Islanders at house shows across the country, cementing their status as legitimate champions. They were fast, polished, and technically sound, a stark contrast to the burgeoning wave of larger-than-life, often cartoonish characters that Vince McMahon was increasingly pushing. And perhaps that was the first subtle crack in their foundation. The immediate aftermath of WrestleMania IV saw a crucial, though largely unacknowledged factor contribute to Strikeforce's demise: Rick Martel's sudden, albeit temporary, departure from the Federation. In July 1988, Martel was storyline injured after taking Demolition's finisher on the floor, effectively splitting up the team. In reality, Martel took an extended leave of absence to care for his wife, who was battling a severe illness. While this was a deeply personal and understandable reason, Vince McMahon was notoriously unforgiving of absences, particularly those not directly related to in-ring injuries. The meticulously planned narratives of the Federation machine ground to a halt for no one, and Martel's absence, regardless of its noble cause, may have soured Vince's view of his commitment. Tito Santana, meanwhile, returned to singles competition, a popular but ultimately directionless mid-carder, a shadow of the tag team champion he had recently been. Martel quietly returned to the Federation in January 1989 at the Royal Rumble. The expectation for many fans was a triumphant reunion with Tito Santana, and for a brief period they did reunite. But something felt different. The magic was gone. They weren't being promoted with the same fervor and prominence. The ultimate betrayal, the final nail in Strikeforce's coffin, occurred at WrestleMania V. On April 2, 1989, at the Trump Plaza once again, Strikeforce faced off against the Brainbusters, Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard, a calculating and ruthless duo. Midway through the match, in a moment that would forever define the end of Strikeforce, Tito Santana accidentally struck Rick Martel with his flying forearm. It was a miscommunication, a mistake in the heat of battle, but for Martel it was the pretext he needed. Instead of recovering, instead of forgiving his partner, Martel simply walked out. He left Santana alone in the ring, abandoning him to the wolves of the Brainbusters. It was a cold, calculated, and utterly devastating heel turn. The message from Vince McMahon was unmistakable. Strikeforce was finished. There would be no redemption arc, no emotional reunion tease. The team was dead, buried with a chilling indifference. So why did Vince McMahon destroy Strikeforce? Several theories, each with its own compelling logic, attempt to unravel this perplexing decision. The first, and perhaps most significant theory, revolves around the evolving landscape of the Federation itself. By 1989, Vince McMahon's vision for the company had fully embraced the larger-than-life ethos. Characters were becoming more colorful, more exaggerated, often bordering on the cartoonish. Demolition, the Bushwhackers, the Powers of Pain. These were the teams Vince was pushing. Strikeforce, with their clean-cut, athletic and relatively normal personas, simply didn't fit into this new, vibrant tapestry. Gimmicks were king, and pure technical babyfaces were becoming a relic of a bygone era. Secondly, Martel's absence due to his wife's illness likely played a crucial, albeit unstated, role. As previously mentioned, Vince McMahon rarely tolerated time away from the ring, especially for personal reasons. In Vince's world, the show must always go on, and loyalty was often measured in unwavering presence. When Martel returned, he wasn't immediately re-pushed as a top babyface. Instead, he was pivoted into a heel role, a decision that could be interpreted as a subtle punishment or a strategic move to reposition an asset who had, in Vince's eyes, shown a lack of unwavering commitment. Santana, for his part, remained in the mid-card, a respected veteran but never again elevated to championship contention, a testament to how the absence of his partner had crippled their collective potential in McMahon's eyes. A third theory posits that Vince McMahon saw more potential in Rick Martel as a heel. After the breakup, Martel transformed into the Model, an arrogant, narcissistic egomaniac who sprayed opponents with his arrogance cologne. This was quintessential Vince McMahon, a caricature gimmick of vanity that was both humorous and infuriating. The Model persona, while never reaching main event status, did achieve a degree of moderate success and longevity. It allowed Martel to reinvent himself, embracing a more theatrical and flamboyant style that aligned better with Vince's evolving taste. Finally, Strikeforce may have simply been a casualty of a hyper-competitive tag team division. The late 1980s saw an embarrassment of riches in the Federation's tag team ranks. The Hart Foundation, the British Bulldogs, Demolition, the Brainbusters, the Rockers. The division was stacked with talent and compelling storylines. There simply wasn't enough screen time, enough belts, or enough top feuds to go around for every deserving team. In such a crowded landscape, a team like Strikeforce, which perhaps lacked the exaggerated gimmicks or the raw power that Vince was gravitating towards, became disposable. They served their purpose as champions, elevating the division, and then became a stepping stone for the newer, more marketable teams that fit Vince's evolving vision. Their downfall was slow, subtle, and undeniably orchestrated. Whether it was the timing of their championship loss, the shifting winds of Vince McMahon's creative vision, or Martel's unavoidable absence, the team was quietly, almost clinically, erased from prominence. In the ruthless, ever-evolving world of Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation, where loyalty and adaptability were paramount, and where the past was often sacrificed for the sake of a perceived future, there were, it seems, no second chances for Strikeforce. Their story serves as a poignant reminder that even the most popular and talented acts could fall victim to the unpredictable whims of professional wrestling's ultimate power broker. The date is March 27, 1988, a brisk, early spring evening in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The cavernous expanse of the convention hall adjacent to Trump Plaza is a swirling kaleidoscope of sound and fury, its air thick with the charged electricity of a sold-out arena. This is WrestleMania IV, and the air crackles with fiery anticipation. The roar of the crowd pulses like a single monstrous heartbeat as the lights dim and the entrance music of the beloved British Bulldogs, Davey Boy Smith and the Dynamite Kid, echoes through the speakers. Alongside them stands the ever-vibrant Coco B. Ware, his macaw, Frankie, a splash of color against the chaotic tapestry. But this is not just a match, it is the climax of a deeply personal and shockingly unhinged feud, one that began with the heinous abduction of a small, furry, four-legged friend. Across the ring stand the Islanders, a pair of men who embody the very essence of a bygone era of wrestling villainy. Managed by the weaselly and ever-loathsome Bobby the Brain Heenan, they are Tonga Fifita and Sam Fatu, better known as Haku and Tama. They are a force of nature, a duo as legitimate and dangerous as any to step inside a wrestling ring during the golden age of the World Wrestling Federation. They possess a primal intensity, a silent, menacing swagger that separates them from the more theatrical heels of the day. As the bell rings, the six men collide in a maelstrom of raw power and athletic prowess, Dynamite Kid, a human whirlwind of aggression, launches Tama over the top rope with a single furious catapult. The Bulldogs are on fire, their offense a blur of power slams and drop kicks, all met with the Islanders' stubborn, unyielding resilience. Koko B. Ware brings his high-flying artistry to the fray, a blur of missile drop kicks and Frankensteiners, but the Islanders are a rock, absorbing the punishment and waiting for their moment. The match is a perfect microcosm of the late 80s Federation Tag Team division. Fast-paced, high-impact, and dripping with storyline. But it's the ending that is most telling. With all 6 men brawling, the referee loses control. The Bulldogs are ordered to their corner, a momentary distraction that the Islanders exploit with ruthless cunning. In a moment of pure Heenan-esque cowardice, Haku and Tama grab their manager and with a single collective heave, throw him onto Koko B. Ware. The impact is enough to secure the pinfall, a shocking and ignominious end for the fan favorites, and a triumphant, albeit underhanded victory for the dastardly villains. The Islanders stand tall, a formidable, sinister tag team at the height of their powers, having just scored a pinfall victory at the biggest event of the year, over one of the most popular teams in the Federation. They were a genuine threat, a tag team with credibility, grit, and a manager whose name was synonymous with success. Yet, a mere month after this undeniable showing of strength and narrative importance, the Islanders were gone, vanished. The team that had dognapped Matilda and pinned Bobby Heenan to a victory at WrestleMania simply ceased to exist. Their abrupt and unceremonious departure from the World Wrestling Federation remains one of the most curious footnotes in the company's golden age. To a casual observer, it is an inexplicable business decision, a choice by a visionary promoter to kill a hot act at its peak. What could possibly have happened? Why would Vince McMahon, a man with an almost preternatural ability to recognize and capitalize on talent, abruptly pull the plug on a team that was so clearly working? The answer, as is often the case in the complex theatrical world of professional wrestling, is not a simple one, and it is a story that reveals much about the shifting tectonic plates of the industry during its most transformative period. To understand their end, we must first understand their beginning. Tonga Fifita, a man who would become known to millions as Haku, first arrived in the Federation in late 1985 as King Tonga, a man of such legitimate toughness that he once famously body-slammed the seemingly unshakable Big John Studd. At the same time, Sam Fatu, wrestling as the Tonga Kid, was already a familiar face to fans, having aided Jimmy Superfly Snuka in his celebrated feud against Rowdy Roddy Piper. The two men, both of Polynesian descent, were a natural pairing, and in mid-1986, they were rechristened as the Islanders. They were, at first, babyfaces, a pair of impressive and athletic competitors who wrestled preliminary matches and slowly but surely began to build a reputation. They scored a major victory in a tag team battle royal at Madison Square Garden, last eliminating the colossal King Kong Bundy and the aforementioned Big John Studd. It was a moment that seemed to signify a future filled with main event bookings. But the Federation of the late 80s was an unforgiving landscape, a veritable cornucopia of talent that was as deep as it was wide. The Islanders, for all their legitimate skill, found themselves lost in the shuffle. They were the first to challenge the newly crowned Hart Foundation, but they were defeated. They then found themselves on the wrong side of a losing streak against the up-and-coming Demolition, in a tag team division overflowing with the likes of the Dream Team, the British Bulldogs, and the Killer Bees. The Islanders were a face team without a clear identity, a pair of gifted athletes without a defined narrative. It was a problem that needed a solution, and that solution arrived in the form of a weasel in a suit. In the spring of 1987, the Islanders were scheduled to face the popular Can-Am Connection, a tag team of Rick Martel and Tom Zenk. It was during this match that Bobby the Brain Heenan appeared at ringside. In the ensuing confusion, the Islanders did the unthinkable. They attacked the fan-favorite Can-Am Connection, turning heel in one of the most memorable moments of the year. With the nefarious Heenan at their side, the Islanders finally had a purpose. They were no longer just a pair of skilled wrestlers. They were the enforcers for the cunningest mind in the business. When Tom Zenk abruptly left the company, Heenan and the Islanders were quick to capitalize, mocking Zenk as a quitter and solidifying their villainous status. Their heel run was a masterclass in professional wrestling storytelling. They feuded with Strikeforce, a newly formed team of Rick Martel and Tito Santana, and though they were unsuccessful in their quest for the Tag Team Championship, their reputation as a formidable duo grew. They were showcased at the very first Survivor Series, where Haku, with his almost superhuman toughness, famously shrugged off a top rope headbutt from the Dynamite Kid, a moment that commentator Jesse Ventura astutely pointed out served to solidify the Islanders as a championship contending team. It was here, in this newfound position of strength, that their greatest and most memorable feud began. The target, once again, was the British Bulldogs. The abduction of Matilda, the Bulldogs' pet mascot, was a storyline so outlandish and simultaneously so effective that it remains a cornerstone of the company's golden era. The Islanders, with Heenan's goading, became villains of the highest order, generating an incredible amount of heat from the crowd. It was a perfect, multi-layered feud that led to their star-making performance at WrestleMania VII. And then it was over. Just weeks after this career-defining moment, the Islanders were no more. The question of why they were killed is a fascinating case study in the inner workings of the Federation at the time, and the reasons are as complex and interconnected as the storylines themselves. The first and most significant factor was the company's shift in philosophy. The Federation was moving decisively from an era of legitimate, tough-as-nails wrestlers to a cartoon-like era of outlandish gimmicks. Demolition, with their face paint and spiked leather, were a clear example. Even the beloved Bushwhackers, with their goofy, arm-licking antics, were a product of this new reality. The Islanders, for all their legitimate toughness, were not cartoonish. They were not flashy. They were tough Polynesians, and while that made them formidable in the ring, it made them difficult to market outside of it. In an era when the Federation was expanding into selling action figures, lunchboxes, and t-shirts, the Islanders had no catchy catchphrase, no standout identity beyond their legitimate toughness. They were simply too real for an era that was becoming increasingly unreal. This brings us to the issue of saturation. The late 80s Federation Tag Team division was an absolute shark tank, stacked with teams that were not only talented, but also had more easily marketable gimmicks. The Hart Foundation were the perfect technical heels. The British Bulldogs were the beloved brawling underdogs. Demolition were the dark, brooding champions. The Powers of Pain were the monstrous super heavyweights. In this sea of creative innovation, the Islanders, for all their skill, were in danger of getting buried by sheer volume. They were, in a sense, a victim of their own straightforward credibility. They were so good at being a tough, menacing tag team that they didn't have the theatrical sparkle that Vince McMahon was beginning to demand from all of his wrestlers. Finally, we arrive at the most probable and most human reason for their demise, the departure of Tama. While there is no smoking gun and the official narrative is often obscured by the passage of time, it seems that the team was creatively sidelined. Tama, in all likelihood, saw the writing on the wall. The team was going nowhere, and he wasn't being considered for a singles push. In an era when McMahon's personal blessing was the only currency that mattered, the Islanders simply never seemed to have a true advocate backstage. Tama's departure in 1988, which followed a loss to the Powers of Pain, was a final decisive nail in the Islanders' coffin. It may have been a voluntary exit, but it was almost certainly an exit born of frustration. A choice to walk away from a company that had decided in its infinite wisdom that a legitimate feared tag team had no place in its increasingly fantastical universe. Haku would go on to have a successful singles run, but the Islanders, that brief, compelling footnote in the history of the Federation's golden age, were gone for good. They were a victim of a changing philosophy, a saturated market, and an era that was leaving genuine toughness behind in favor of pure theatrical spectacle. The date is November 26, 1987. The Richfield Coliseum in Ohio crackles with raw energy as wrestling history unfolds before 21,000 screaming fans. The inaugural Survivor Series, Vince McMahon's bold gambit to counter-program the Starrcade on Thanksgiving night, has reached its climactic moment. Bodies litter the ringside area like fallen gladiators. The ring canvas tells the story of carnage. 10 tag teams entered this elimination gauntlet, but now only 4 men remain standing. The crowd erupts as they realize what has just transpired. Against all odds, 2 teams from the same side have emerged victorious from the chaos. First, the seasoned veterans known as the Killer Bees, Jim Brunzell and B. Brian Blair, masked warriors who've navigated the treacherous waters of sports entertainment for years. And celebrating alongside them, catching their breath and surveying the battlefield they've somehow survived together, stand 2 young men who, just 8 months earlier, were nothing more than human crash test dummies for wrestling's elite. Paul Roma and Jim Powers of the Young Stallions. The crowd watches in amazed jubilation as these apparent nobodies, these enhancement talents who were supposed to lose and make others look good, raise their arms in triumph alongside their veteran teammates. Roma's dark hair gleams with perspiration, his muscular frame betraying none of the exhaustion that should consume a man who's just outlasted Strikeforce, the Hart Foundation, Demolition, and 5 other established teams. The parallels to another underdog story resonated through the arena that night, though few could have recognized them in real time. Just over a decade earlier, yet still firmly implanted in the collective consciousness, a fictional boxer named Rocky Balboa had captured America's imagination by going the distance with Apollo Creed, transforming from a Philadelphia nobody into a symbol of perseverance. Now, in the squared circle of professional wrestling, 2 real-life underdogs were living their own version of that mythic tale. Young, hungry, and handsome specimens who'd clawed their way from the bottom of the card to share in wrestling immortality alongside their veteran teammates. But unlike Rocky's story, this one would end not with triumph, but with burial. And the man wielding the shovel would be none other than Vincent Kennedy McMahon himself. The Young Stallions' journey to that fateful November night began in the shadows of mediocrity, where careers go to die and dreams are systematically dismantled. In March 1987, Roma and Powers were thrown together in what wrestling insiders call enhancement talent. Working athletes whose primary function was to make established stars appear dominant. They were human sacrificial lambs, expected to bump and sell and lose with dignity while collecting modest paychecks for their troubles. Their first pairing came at a Las Vegas taping, where they faced the dominant force of Demolition, Axe and Smash, the up-and-coming most devastating tag team in the company. Roma and Powers lost as expected. They lost again to the new Dream Team. They lost to combinations of Butch Reed, Iron Sheik, and Nikolai Volkov. Loss after loss accumulated like storm clouds on the horizon of their careers. But something curious began happening as spring turned to summer. These 2 enhancement talents, these professional losers, started showing flashes of something more. Roma carried himself with the swagger of a star, his movements fluid and confident even in defeat. Powers possessed a different energy entirely, quieter, grittier, the kind of determined intensity that resonated with working-class fans who saw their own struggles reflected in his methodical approach to the craft. Their first significant breakthrough came in the most unlikely of venues, Madison Square Garden, wrestling's hallowed cathedral. On May 18, 1987, Roma and Powers achieved what seemed impossible, a clean victory over established veterans Bob Orton and Don Muraco. The win would later air on primetime wrestling, giving national television audiences their first glimpse of something special brewing between the 2 young stallions. As summer progressed, their momentum built like a symphony approaching crescendo. They defeated the Shadows on television. They began winning house show matches against established competition. But the real watershed moment came on August 8, 1987, when they faced the reigning tag team champions, the Hart Foundation, in a non-title match. Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart weren't just champions. They were Vince McMahon's hand-picked representatives of tag team excellence. Yet the Young Stallions won. It was a victory so stunning that even seasoned wrestling observers had to recalibrate their expectations. Enhancement talent simply didn't defeat tag team champions even in non-title scenarios. But Roma and Powers had done exactly that, and suddenly the wrestling world was forced to take notice of these 2 previously anonymous performers. Their ascension continued through the late summer, with victories over teams that had previously dominated them. They defeated Kamala and Sika via countout on an episode of Superstars. They beat the Hart Foundation again by disqualification on Primetime Wrestling. Each victory added another layer to their growing legend, another reason for fans to invest emotionally in their unlikely rise. It was around this time that fate, or perhaps Vince McMahon's showmanship instincts, gifted them with their moniker. During a match, play-by-play commentator McMahon himself referred to the duo as a couple of young stallions, and the name stuck with the organic inevitability of all great wrestling appellations. The Young Stallions had acquired not just a team name, but an identity that perfectly captured their youthful energy and unbridled potential. They inherited the entrance music initially intended for the Hart Foundation, Crank It Up, a driving rock anthem that seemed custom-designed for their increasingly confident ring entrances. They earned their first Saturday night's main event appearance, wrestling's equivalent of primetime television stardom. Though they lost narrowly to the Hart Foundation in that October showcase, the match itself represented validation. McMahon was investing television time in their development, and then came Survivor Series, their crowning achievement and the pinnacle of their improbable rise. In a match featuring 10 of the Federation's most established tag teams, the Young Stallions not only survived, they thrived. They eliminated Greg Valentine and Dino Bravo, the new Dream Team, with Roma hitting a picture-perfect diving sunset flip. When the dust settled and the final pin was counted, Roma and Powers stood triumphant alongside the Killer Bees as the surviving members of their team, having outlasted legends and champions alike in a stunning team victory. For one shining moment, the Rocky Balboa parallel seemed complete. Two unknown fighters had gone the distance against impossible odds, proving that heart and determination could triumph over reputation and politics. The wrestling world seemed to lie at their feet, ripe for conquest. But wrestling, unlike Hollywood movies, doesn't always reward its underdogs with happy endings. The cracks in their foundation began appearing almost immediately. At the 1988 Royal Rumble, they lost decisively to the Islanders in a best-of-3 falls match, with Roma suffering what appeared to be a legitimate knee injury. Though they continued winning on house shows through the early months of 1988, something fundamental had shifted in the company's perception of their value. Behind the scenes, whispers began circulating about tension between the team members themselves. Roma and Powers, despite their undeniable chemistry in the ring, reportedly couldn't stand each other outside of it. The swagger and intensity that made them compelling performers apparently extended into personal animosity, creating backstage friction that McMahon and his team found increasingly problematic. More significantly, the wrestling landscape itself was evolving around them. The company was transitioning toward larger-than-life characters, cartoon personas that could transcend traditional wrestling audiences and appeal to mainstream entertainment consumers. Hulk Hogan's All-American Superhero act had proven the viability of this approach, and McMahon was systematically reshaping his roster to emphasize spectacle over athletic credibility. In this new paradigm, the Young Stallions' greatest strengths became liabilities. Their natural athleticism and believable personas made them seem almost mundane compared to the colorful characters McMahon was prioritizing. They were too real for a company increasingly committed to fantasy. The final nail in their coffin came with the arrival of another young tag team in late May 1988. Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, collectively known as the Rockers. Here was everything McMahon wanted in his new wrestling landscape. Flashier presentation, more dynamic personalities, and perhaps most importantly, genuine friendship between the team members. The Rockers offered all of the Young Stallions' athletic credibility, with none of their backstage complications. McMahon's interest in Roma and Powers evaporated like morning mist. By summer 1988, they were losing to teams they'd previously defeated. The Bolsheviks, whom they dominated during their peak, suddenly began beating them regularly. They even lost to the Conquistadors, masked jobbers who represented the absolute bottom of the tag team hierarchy. At the 1988 Survivor Series, exactly 1 year after their greatest triumph, the Young Stallions were among the first teams eliminated, a humiliating reversal of fortune that seemed designed to erase any lingering memories of their previous success. Their final months as a team played out like a slow-motion car crash. Victories became increasingly rare, partnerships increasingly sporadic. By 1989, Roma and Powers were wrestling together only occasionally. their team existing more in memory than reality. Their last victory came in June 1989 against Boris Zhukov and Barry Horowitz. Enhancement talent defeating enhancement talent in wrestling's cruel circular hierarchy. Their final match as the Young Stallions occurred on August 7, 1989, a loss to the powers of pain on primetime wrestling. There was no angle to explain their dissolution, no storyline to provide closure. They simply stopped existing as a unit, fading into wrestling's collective unconscious, like a half-remembered dream. Paul Roma would eventually find some measure of success as part of Power and Glory, alongside Hercules, turning heel and adopting the cartoonish persona that McMahon preferred. He'd even face his former partner Jim Powers in singles competition, winning all 6 of their encounters in August 1990. A final indignity that completed their fall from grace. Powers himself would linger in the Federation until 1994, occasionally forming temporary partnerships but never recapturing the magic of his Stallions days. In the end, the Young Stallions became exactly what they'd been designed to be from the beginning. A footnote in wrestling history, enhancement talent whose brief moment of glory served only to highlight the success of others. Their rise and fall perfectly encapsulated the arbitrary nature of sports entertainment success. How quickly heroes could be manufactured, and how easily they could be discarded when their usefulness expired. Unlike Rocky Balboa, whose fictional journey culminated in triumph and vindication, the Young Stallions discovered that real-world underdogs don't always get their happy endings. Sometimes, the man controlling the narrative decides that your story has run its course. And sometimes, the most compelling comeback story is the one that Vince McMahon never allows to be written. The Young Stallions seemingly had everything: the look, the talent, and the chemistry. What they didn't have was the one thing that mattered most in Vince McMahon's empire: his sustained interest. That made all the difference between immortality and irrelevance, between legend and footnote, between Rocky Balboa and 2 forgotten jobbers buried into oblivion.